Welcome to Reduce Your Stress with Tim Ringgold. I'm a board-certified music therapist, author, and expert on how to use music to relieve stress fast. This episode of Reduce Your Stress with Tim Ringgold is sponsored by Dr. Nisi, trainer and certifier of master and executive coaches, because she believes every person, every relationship, every business, and your finances should be extraordinary. Find out more about Dr. Nisi Moore and the Life Coaching Institute at www.drnisi.com. That's DRNEECIE.com. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Reduce Your Stress with Tim Ringgold. It's so great to be with you, and I'm so glad you're here. This week's episode is an interview with a fellow music therapist turned entrepreneur named Brian Harris. Brian is the CEO and co-founder of an innovative company called MedRhythms, which creates digital therapeutic devices to help people walk again after a stroke, brain injury, or neurologic disease. Brian is one of only 350 people in the world to hold the title of Neurologic Music Therapy Fellow and has been serving patients in neuro rehab at the Spalding Neurologic Institute in Boston since 2015, where he founded the program. Now, Brian's work may not be specifically related to stress reduction. I mean, he only helps people walk again. That's all. But our conversation underscores the power of music on the brain and the body, and how digital devices can deliver music to us in ever increasingly curated and targeted ways. So sit back, get inspired, and I'll see you on the other side. Brian Harris, welcome to the podcast. It's so great to reconnect with you.
Thanks, Tim. Awesome to be reconnected and honored to be here. Nice to see you again, even virtually.
Yeah, right. That's it. So you are physically in the state of where?
I'm in the lovely state of Maine, in Portland, Maine. Yes.
Beautiful. So we are connecting across corners. I'm in the other corner, Southern California, but born and bred in New England, in Connecticut. So
yes.
So
beautiful place, particularly in the summertime.
Yeah, right.
We're loving life right now.
Yeah, exactly. So let's start. So for the listener, Brian and I are both music therapists, and we met at a music therapy conference years ago and immediately connected like, oh, the cool guy in me recognizes the cool guy in you. More like the smart mofo in me recognizes the smart mofo in you. And there was like a mutual connection like that. And I've watched your journey since then online, and I'm fascinated by what you're up to. And so I wanted to share it with our listeners today. But I want to kind of start at the beginning, because it's always fascinating to hear someone's kind of origin story. Mm-hmm. So like, where did you first meet music?
Yeah, it's interesting because I didn't grow up in a musical family or a family that had musicians, or really, I would say, pushed or appreciated music in any greater way than I would say an average family. And so I actually had my first interactions with music in school by taking lessons in music class. I think everybody went through the awesome recorder journey, where you learn the recorder in second or third grade or something like that, which was great. But my first, I would say, sort of love for music came when I started taking private lessons early in elementary school as a violist. And so I was always very intrigued by unique instruments that, I guess maybe I wanted to be a little bit different, and I didn't want, to play the popular ones. And so I started with viola, and I think that's really where the spark started for the love of music. And then as I went on in sort of schooling, picked up drum kit, and that was, I would say, the second love that then sort of, I think, took over my musical passion in terms of performance was drum kit. So, yeah.
Got it. Cool. And was drumming was that something you did inside of school in like an ensemble, or was that something you kind of like rocked out on the side and that was your kind of, antidote to viola? Or?
Yeah, it was a little bit of all of the above. So I certainly started in the sort of school trajectory on the snare drum, learning the the rudiments there. But then when I, first sat behind a drum kit is when I really fell in love, right? I mean, that's when it all comes together. And so from that point, I started playing in jazz bands and rock bands. And, I did the college circuit type band sort of thing and played in a couple of bands in college that, just had a blast. But I always loved the sort of the balance between, because I played viola seriously until I graduated high school as well. And so I was in a full orchestra. I played in a quartet that traveled a bit as well. And then, I did my pep band, rock band, jazz band thing with the drums. And I always loved that balance and the appreciation for music across the spectrum, because they're so drastically different in terms of genre and connection. But there's something very much to be appreciated across that spectrum. So I always enjoyed it.
That's cool. You don't usually hear it. Like there was a joke in Anchorman Ron Burgundy where he plays jazz flute, but you don't often hear jazz viola.
Exactly.
Or lead viola in the rock band. It's
exactly. It's actually interesting because I think one of the most unique pieces that I ever performed on viola was this song called, and it was actually in orchestra that we played this, sort of full symphony orchestra, and it was called Blues for a Killed Cat. And it was this really heavy blues tune that was actually led by the trombones, but the viola also had this just wild blues thing going on. I had never played anything like that on the viola. And I'm like, this is it's such a cool place to be. And then I remember that when we were playing in the quartet, we did a Beatles medley. And that was a lot of fun because that was the input from the rock genre in early days. And so I think those maybe non-obvious connections or collaborations between music, it's awesome.
That's cool. Very cool. Now, each of us, what I noticed when I found my way to music therapy, I was 32 and I thought I'm going to be way behind, everybody else is going to be kids. But there was half the program were, reentry students that were adults coming back and had discovered music therapy after the fact. How did you bump into music therapy?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I knew going through school that music was going to be a big part of my life and a part of my career. What I also knew, I think early on, was that music education was not for me. I knew that wasn't really the route that I wanted to go. Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of us can maybe appreciate that. And I also loved performance, but when we thought about a career, I also didn't feel that connection to a professional sort of touring musician or studio musician or whatever that might be. I actually heard randomly about music therapy in high school, and the idea, I had no idea what it was. I mean, as I think many people still, there's a large unawareness of it, but I had no idea what it was. But the idea of using music to help people was really compelling. And so I said, hey, whatever this is, let's pursue it. And actually I went to college at the University of Maine. I studied psychology. I minored in music with this idea that music therapy was this thing that I would pursue. And I had a moment at the University of Maine to take an online class in music therapy that was taught by, at the time, the only private practicing music therapist in the state of Maine. And just for some context, the state of Maine is huge by area, not a lot of people, but huge. It was the only private practicing music therapist. And I fell in love with the content. So this is just awesome, using music in this way. But what really changed my life, I will say, in that trajectory was I had an opportunity to intern with this music therapist for a summer. And he was working with children and adults with severe developmental delays. And he was trained not in neuroscience, and I'm sure we'll dive into that. That's really my background and my focus here. He was not trained in that area of music therapy. And he was working with children and adults that, as I mentioned, with severe developmental delays. And the first session that I ever saw live music therapy was with a boy who was about 18 years old. And he was physically and cognitively functioning at about a 1-year-old level. So very, very low functioning boy. And they wheeled him in his wheelchair into the room. And I was, my role there as an intern was really, and I had no clinical training at that point. So I was really sort of just kind of being hands-on, with instruments and things with him. Within the first 10 minutes of the music therapist presenting live music in his environment to this boy, the boy began functioning cognitively at a higher level than what anybody in his life had ever seen before. Meaning the people that were his family that worked with him every day came in the room and were literally in tears because they couldn't believe how this boy was functioning. And I think that, as music therapists, that's not a novel story. Music therapists have these moments often. But what changed my life about that was it was at that moment that I knew that that this was my calling in life, that I needed to be using music in this way to help people. But two was this question of if we could, music has always historically been, described of as magic, right? And it is. Like there's an undescribable power of music. However, if there was a way that we could actually explain why this boy was having this response to music neurologically, and there must be a reason why. If we could explain it, that's when we could really harness the power of music and then replicate it to help a lot of people so that we could go from magic to science in whatever form that we can do that, and then, replicate it to help a lot of people. And that's what really got me focused on the neuroscience of music and changed my entire trajectory of my life, in fact. So.
Wow. Yeah. It's so funny when you said this is not novel for music therapists, because I remember being a new music therapist and I I'm a contractor and I'm working with adults who are intellectually and developmentally delayed or disabled. And I show up and I'm quote unquote doing my thing, with the group, leading them in music. And this guy's standing up and he's singing along and the staff's crying. And I'm like, what'd I do wrong? But my first thought, I thought I was in trouble. You know what I mean? I was like, oh, whoops. And they were like, no, you don't understand. We've never heard his voice. Like, what? Man. Right? You're like, what? Because we kind of roll into these clinical settings and we see their brain on music, but we haven't spent days, weeks, months, years with them with their brain off music. So we don't have any point of reference. And this happens with patients with dementia, right? Alzheimer's happens, kids on the spectrum, like it happens to us as clinicians all the time,
right? Because
we see their brain on music and we just kind of like, oh yeah, there you go. That's what it looks like. That's what the brain looks like on music. But that gap between the pre-music brain and then the on music brain, I sometimes take for granted how big that difference is.
Right. I mean, as we think about, we live in that, right? As you mentioned, these are replicable things that we see all the time. It doesn't mean that we underappreciate it, but I think you don't appreciate that people don't see that all the time. And for, this person you worked with, the first time that they heard their voice, right? My background is in neuro rehab, is where I spent most of my clinical experience. So treating people post-stroke, traumatic brain injury, and our most profound moments oftentimes were the first steps that they take after their injury, or, the first time that they hear their voice after they've had the brain damage. And it's amazing because we come in and we say, well, I'm a music therapist. My objective is to get you to use your voice and to get you your first step. And so when it happens, we say, check, I did my job. Right. And then, this is, not to belittle the outcome, but that's what we're charged with doing. And we can do that replicably and with evidence. Right. And so, but I think it's hard to appreciate what that looks like to their family members for the first time. Right. Yeah. It's a powerful experience. It's a
powerful experience. I remember having a group as an intern where it was elderly adults who were in a group home, and when we showed up, they're in a circle ready. And we walk in and immediately just start interacting with them and handing out instruments and start making music. And it's alive and there's this energy and fun and they're cracking jokes and, laughing and shaking and singing. And I left my sweater. And so I'm like 90 minutes later, I realize I left my sweater at this facility. So I get in the car, I drive back to the facility to go pick up my sweater. I couldn't believe it was the same facility. Because 90 minutes later, not only had the, furniture been rearranged and all the people were disconnected spatially, but the energy, the vitality, the engagement, the spark
Right.
was completely missing from the room. And that's when I had my first experience of seeing like an AB. It was more like a BA,
Right.
experience.
Right.
And I was like, oh, whoa, wow.
It's
Okay.
different.
I get it now. I get it.
Right.
And,
Right.
but, like you said, though, key point is not in our Western medical veil that we all wear, this very like, I can't use the word magic and be
Mhm.
taken seriously as a clinician, right? Even though I am crystal clear, music is magic and
Mhm.
fine, but how do I translate what's happening? And that's kind of what set you really ablaze, right? Was like this process, like, okay, what's going on under the hood?
Correct.
So
So
kind of
what?
tell me where that, took you.
Yeah, my first job that I had was at Spalding Rehab Hospital in Boston, which is it's the Harvard Medical School affiliate for neuro rehab hospitals. It's one of the top, one of the leading neuro rehab hospitals in the country. And I was their first music therapist, so I had the honor of actually sort of building their music therapy program, which was amazing, working with stroke and brain injury patients. So at this point, I knew sort of I had been trained in the neurological processes of how the brain processes music, produces music, et cetera, how we can use that to improve outcomes. I'd been trained in some of the standardized interventions that we can use to help people improve walking or talking or, attention, memory, these types of things. But then it became this question of when I started in the hospital, it was very clear during our interventions that we were doing that patients were getting better faster with greater results. And we now had that neuroscience to not only explain how this was possible, but also how we could standardize and replicate it. Right. And so as we think about, and particularly when we have these conversations with music therapists or about music therapists or about music therapy, there's no doubt that there's a subjective element to music that is important in clinical care. And that's important in clinical outcomes, just like a relationship is important to any therapy, speech therapy, mental health therapy, it doesn't matter. Relationships are important. However, and we'll say comma, and there's also an objective power of music that can be used and implemented and standardized regardless of a relationship, regardless of somebody's approach to music or their familiarity with music. And as we think about neuro rehab, it was that objective piece that I got even more compelled by. So you're telling me that we can explain how this can be replicated in nearly the entire human population based upon neuroscience research. And I'm watching my patient not be able to walk in physical therapy, but to be able to walk when we do our intervention, or not be able to speak in speech therapy, but be able to say an entire phrase by the time we're done, objectively. And why doesn't every single person on earth have access to this? Right. And that was really my driving question at that point was, okay, now we understand it. How do we bring it to people? Right? How do we scale this? And you learn very quickly in medicine, and I think particularly in healthcare, particularly at a Harvard Medical School hospital, right, is that you understand, I wouldn't say for bad reason, but why music is magic doesn't cut it, right? Like there's a reason why, the FDA exists and there's claims and there's things like that, right? So there's a reason why we need to have evidence to support these things, but we now have that. And so how do we start talking the language? And then how do we start getting it to the right people? And that's really, really what sort of was the root of it all.
Yeah, that's so inspiring. I think this may happen to a lot of practitioners who get results with the modality that they've been trained in, and they feel so good about that. But to your point about music, there's an art to music and there's a science to music. And one of the things I always try to explain to people is that, music therapists really spend our time, understanding the science of music and why all brains and all nervous systems will respond the same way to an external tempo, for example, right? It's like, and for me, I was working in the ICU with patients who were in a coma and being like, my job was to lower their heart rate, their blood pressure, the respiratory rhythm with music, and they're in a coma, right? So it's not subjective at that point. And that was one of those moments for me where I was like, this is just predictable, Like you can, like every time I walk in here, I just take the notes. Here's what it was before I started: heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rhythm. Here's what I did. I matched my arpeggio, my rhythm on my guitar to their heart rate. And then after about 5 minutes, I started to slow it down, and it followed only just about every time, and it was funny because from the musician side, I would be stuck with, I'm just playing a C chord.
But you're playing the C chord that he needed.
Yes, but it's like, it can't be. This is when you're on. It can't be that simple, right? It's like it can't be that simple. And yet, what we know from research is oftentimes the body responds very clearly to very simple things, like if you breathe through your nose into your belly, it tells your vagus nerve to switch off the sympathetic nervous system response. If you breathe through your mouth into your shoulders, it tells the nerve to turn on. And it's all brains, noses, lungs operate that same way. It doesn't matter what language you speak. And so it was this fascinating, like, oh, this is happening beyond genre, beyond music preference, beyond personality. Like, hey, we really get along. This is the science. And so that got me excited, but it also was challenging because I can't scale. Right. And so this is what I noticed was, after a year of working in the hospital, my data showed that my average amount of times I saw a patient was 1.4 or 1.3. So it was very transactional. But I realized that people had access to devices, smartphones and tablets 24/7. And I started to get more interested in apps, because apps and recorded music used at the right time, the right device used at the right time for the right reason, can be somewhere I'm not. And I never forget working with one patient. This is what sent me on my journey. She was an oncology patient, and I did a relaxation experience with her. She goes, and this is dating the story, but she said, do you have that on CD? And I said, no, I just do it live. She goes, well, where are you going to be at 2 a.m. when I need you? And it was like a punch in the face, right? Really woke me up to like, oh, that's right. You need this. And so I have been on my end totally intimidated by technology and by app development and see the need for it. But you have kind of thrown yourself in that world, and kind of tell me, is it a similar kind of, like, you did the math, you realize there's only one of you, and how do I scale interventions, or what drove you in the direction you're in now?
Yeah, I mean, it was fundamentally that, right? So as you're treating patients in the hospital, and you're seeing these outcomes, the questions that we're getting asked me, I think it's important to provide context for, I was in a neuro rehab hospital that was an inpatient hospital where patients stayed for, on average, 14 days following brain injury, stroke, et cetera. I functioned much like a physical therapist, occupational therapist, speech therapist, but we were focused really on improving walking and, improving walking, improving language and cognition, et cetera. So we started to see these very measurable, objective results in our patients, particularly the patients as we were improving walking, right? Like, you can literally show and measure somebody's stride length improving, somebody's speed improving, their cadence improving, the distance that they can walk improving, more so than just when they were doing physical therapy. So then what started to happen is the demand for those services, both within the hospital, meaning, the doctors writing orders for me to see their patients, but also from the patients and their family members, when we're doing these interventions, are saying, Brian, you helped my dad walk again. How do I get more of this when I leave the hospital? And I was having weekly conversations with patients and their family members saying, there's nothing you can do. And as a clinician, that's an awful conversation to have with your patients and family members on a regular basis. And music therapists deal with this all the time. So the question that becomes, well, how do we scale, right? We actually started MedRhythms as a therapy services company to hire other music therapists trained through neuroscience, doing neurologic music therapy, to meet this demand. And what we very quickly realized, and we talk about business for a minute, is it's very slow and expensive to scale a services business. Also, in healthcare, that is very slow to move. Number two is we quickly found out that fundamentally there aren't enough music therapists for us in the country to hire to meet the need that we felt like A, there was, and B, that we had the potential to meet. And a quick statistic for you about that is that this is one of the things that just flipped the switch for me was we always talk about music therapy being standard of care, right? That it should be standard of care. When somebody has a neuro injury or disease, they get, referred to just like PT, OT, and speech, music therapy, right? Well, in the country, right, as you know, there's somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 board certified music therapists in the entire United States of America. The largest physical therapy company has 10,000 employees, and they own 3% of the physical therapy market. Okay. So as we think about talking about standard of care or wanting to become standard of care, the reality is in current state of the world, and I'm not advocating that that shouldn't change. I'm saying that in current state of the world, it's fundamentally not possible for that to happen. So then if we say, if it's fundamentally not possible for this to happen, how do we scale and reach more people? And the answer is technology. And I was, I was at the beginning of this a bit, I would say not resistant to technology, but thinking about, well, can technology really replicate what I can do, right? Like this is a real thing. And I was treating a patient who happened to be the brother of an executive at Spalding who wanted further treatment at home. And we started thinking about technology in terms of telemedicine at first. And I said, well, maybe we could do it via telemedicine, but it wouldn't be as good as a live person, right? Like that's our response, right? The technology does not enable us to help more people. It really like waters down our results. And he looked me square in the eyes and said, well, Brian, wouldn't 70% of you be better than nothing? And I said, fair point. So as I thought about this, I said, well, let's figure this out. And we started developing, really looking at a product that could improve walking. So actually not telemedicine, but could we use sensors and algorithms to replicate an intervention that we do? And what I very quickly found was that technology is now in a place with the data that we can collect, that the technology that can be developed may actually do better than a clinician in some areas and in some interventions because of the fidelity of data that it can create and the decisions that it can make faster than a human can. And so that has become a very exciting trajectory to watch over the course as we've built this product to say like, yeah, it can be as good as a clinician. And I think that in some scenarios, it actually could be better than a clinician at this specific intervention. Not that the product is ever going to replace music therapists at large, but could it help more music therapists, more physical therapists reach people in home where music therapists can't go? And I think we're seeing, that there's some potential there.
That's amazing. So tell me a little bit about what the actual product is and how it works, what it does.
Yeah, so we have, we're building digital therapeutics, which is essentially, we think about these as being evidence-based, FDA-regulated prescription products. So we actually build them much like a pharmaceutical company builds pharmacological drugs. So we go through feasibility studies, pivotal trials, where we're collecting data such that we can make a claim about a product in a disease state. So we can say this improves walking speed in X population by X%. And they're going to be prescription products. So that's sort of the framing of this. It's not an app that you download in the app store. It's really a more of a medical device that we're building. But it has sensors that connect to the shoe that collect clinical grade data about how people walk, about how patients walk. We get about 40 data points for every step that a person takes. So when we think about like high fidelity data, right? That feeds into our algorithm, which is based upon an application on a mobile device. And then we deliver rhythmic stimuli or music via headphones. What we're actually doing is replicating an intervention that's called rhythmic auditory stimulation. It's been studied for about 3 decades in sort of more of a lab setting, demonstrating its efficacy to improve outcomes like speed, symmetry, cadence, fall risk, et cetera, across disease states. So stroke, MS, Parkinson's disease, CP, aging, et cetera. We are essentially digitizing rhythmic auditory stimulation. So the data comes into the algorithms. We've taught the algorithms how to look at that data and then change music to push people to walk faster with better quality of data. So it's like a closed loop system. Data comes in, music changes. As the music changes, the person's walking changes, and that closed loop system happens. And we're building products for each disease state that I mentioned across neuroinjury disease. So stroke, MS, PD, et cetera.
Wow. That's amazing, dude. That's super, super neat that, that, like you just said, this closed loop of information can be created, harnessed, managed, and then in real time adjusted to the patient's need, and then deliver those outcomes. Do you guys, so where are you along the process?
Yeah, so healthcare is a long process. If anybody wants to become an entrepreneur in healthcare and you're building products, it's a very long process because of clinical trials, FDA approvals, et cetera. We are furthest along in a product that's for chronic stroke. So these are folks that are at least 3 to 6 months post-stroke. It's called the chronic phase, when people sort of stop getting physical therapy or occupational therapy, but they still have deficits that persist. It's considered the chronic phase of stroke. And we've done an early feasibility study there, we look at objective outcomes, so improvement in speed, biomechanics, et cetera. That's been published in a top neuro rehab journal last year. And then we are in the midst of our pivotal trial. So this pivotal trial is termed, which is the data that's going to be used to submit to the FDA. Last year on that product, we were granted breakthrough designation by the FDA. So basically they looked at the existing clinical data that we had on our product, and they gave us breakthrough designation, which means that they believe that we have the potential to make an impact in an area of high unmet medical need. And so through that process, that gives us some advantages in terms of getting through the FDA approval process. It's not an approval, but get through the process faster because they believe that this is important to meet an unmet need. And so we're getting much closer now to wrapping up that pivotal trial, and then it'll be an FDA submission and hopefully approval. For the music lovers out there, and I find this it's very exciting for me and rewarding for me. To my knowledge, when this becomes FDA approved, it will be the world's first prescription music. Wow. So the only way that you can, not a referral to a music therapist or something, but it's an actual, you get X drug, Y drug, Z drug music. And the only way that patients will have access to it is through a prescription from a physician. So, we're really excited about that, and to hopefully that helps to move the needle for all music therapists to say that music has this benefit. Go find a music therapist, right? So,
yeah, amazing.
Exciting times.
Amazing. Well, kudos for being willing to step out into the wind as a pioneer and not draft, when you're first, there's nothing there. So it's all headwind. And it's, there's this great quote from Jim Rohn, which is that success is about doing a bunch of things that are actually relatively easy. The problem is it's just easier not to. Mm-hmm. And, when you're this long journey that you're on, like you said, there's a lot of points where it's just easier not to. It's just easier not to. And you've been at it for quite a while. And like I said, that's one of the reasons you're on today, is because I've been watching, this journey and just so inspired by your tenacity and your vision and your commitment that, like, look, there are people in need and we can do something about it. Let's go. Mm-hmm. Giddy up. Mm-hmm. So, well done.
And I will say it's interesting because my entrepreneurial journey to this has not been because I grew up thinking to myself, man, like, I want to be an entrepreneur. Like, I just want to start companies. Like, particularly if I did that, why would you ever start with healthcare? Right? Oh, like, it's not the right sector to be in. But I did have this, fundamental feeling that when you have a need, and then you have the solution to the need, and this need is not, it's not subjective. It's not light. I mean, this is changing people's lives, like literally changing people's lives. And when you have a solution to the need, I felt like I had a responsibility to do something about it. And so I was driven into entrepreneurship through this sort of, you call it a calling, but I really felt like I had a responsibility that if there was a way to make this work, to pursue it at all costs. which means a lot of very small actions, right? A lot of very small doing things to get you there in the larger picture. So, I mean, we still got a long ways to go, don't get me wrong. And a lot of other large mountains to climb, but we will push as hard as we can to get there.
Yeah. Awesome. Keep up the great work.
Awesome.
Thanks for being with us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for checking out this episode of Reduce Your Stress with Tim Ringgold. I've got a couple of resources for you, which you can find in the show notes or you can listen to right here. So check it out. If you enjoy the sound of my voice and you enjoy the sound of my guitar, imagine them put together. Go to sonicrecovery.com and take your very own relaxation vacation, where I take you out of the stress of the present moment and back in time to a time when you felt happy, healthy, safe, and sober, and then walk you through that memory so you can bring back those feelings into the challenges you're facing today. So go check that out. It's at sonicrecovery.com. If you're a healthcare worker in recovery, check out the Music in Recovery Self-Care Guide for healthcare professionals that I created just for you. That's at hcp.sonicrecovery.com. And if you're a healthcare worker and you'd like more information about how to help your patients use music, you can check out the Music Medicine Guide that I created just for you at musicmedicineguide.com. Lastly, if you enjoyed the pod and you haven't done it yet, would you just take a minute to rate and review it? It really only takes about 60 seconds, believe it or not, and it would go a long way to help us make more people know just how good this pod is, particularly for healthcare workers and their stress. Thanks again. See you next time.